right. Welcome to session 3 of the second topic of the semester, the European discovery, conquest, and colonization of America. So this is session 3. And so far, in session 1 and session 2, we have covered the discovery and the conquest, those two particular segments of this topic. The discovery, we cover a great deal with, dealing with Europe and the ancient world, the ancient Greeks, the Romans, for example, feudalism, we covered that in great detail. The transition from feudalism into long distance trade, what we call mercantilism, for example, the rise of a new commercial economy, a commercial revolution. Global trade networks that began to connect continents and many areas of the world together through commercial exchange. And then we were looking at the technological revolution in navigation that allowed for a more fast-paced transportation of goods, which eventually, of course, led to the discovery of America in 1492. So, we discussed that very fully, and of course we talked about how by the 1400s, with the rise of mercantilism, there's already a very well established monetary system based on gold, the so-called gold standard. We covered that and how the pursuit of gold had transformed the economies of Europe and the world that was participating in that particular trade, in terms of merchants, landowners, and monarchs being now motivated to pursue trade as a way to acquire gold, for example. So we cover that in very great depth. And of course, when we were looking at the discovery of America, we looked at the conquest itself. In this case, we just looked at the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs and the Incas, and we were looking at, for example, how the discovery of America was part of a process, again, of pursuing international trade, whether, the trade routes to the Far East. Columbus was motivated to seek a trade route, of course, to Asia, to China, India, and then ended up discovering America, of course. But when the Spaniards are arriving, of course, to America, they're going to be the forerunners of colonization. They're going to stumble upon certain empires as they were surveying the area, surveying the land, pursuing, of course, resources, pursuing gold. And in this process, they're going to stumble upon the Aztec Empire of Central Mexico and the Inca Empire of South America. So we looked at, again, the factors that led the Spaniards to actually conquer the Aztecs and the Incas, and we covered that fully in session 2. We're just looking at steel technology, for example, things like epidemic disease, the role of Native American religious ideas for accepting defeat, whether because they were expecting the return of certain gods, which coincided with the arrival of the Spaniards, or because in some situations, like in the Inca example I explained, that the Incas experienced the arrival of the Spaniards as a supernatural event, a supernatural phenomenon in which, because they have never seen the Spaniards, they believe that they were witnessing something extraordinary in terms of perhaps ghosts or spirits or ancestors or perhaps gods, again, manifesting in this reality, because of the weaponry, the animals they brought, and so on and so forth. Again, it appeared very strange, and of course, they also interpreted the Spanish as to be the thunder gods. So we talked about that again in session 2, and of course that influenced their beliefs about what they were experiencing and witnessing, and of course they ended up accepting defeat eventually because of the magnitude, perhaps, of those experiences, and that's how they cope with those experiences by using their own religious ideas, and again, that contributed to their defeat, if you will, which ultimately allowed the Spaniards, with very few numbers, by the way, to conquer those societies. So now in this session 3, what we're going to be doing is, let me now go to the outline, the lecture outline, and again, this is the third segment of this topic, in which we're going to cover colonization. Now, we're not going to deal with the entire colonial period, but rather we're going to simply cover the early colonization process, when the Europeans are arriving and they're beginning to establish a series of outposts, and in this case, those outposts will transform into colonies. And since we have been dealing with the discovery and the conquest, this process of the European discovery, the age of discovery, the discovery of America, and the conquest, of course, of the Aztecs and the Incas, through an economic perspective, an economic analysis. So the colonization is also going to follow that same train of thought, in which we're going to apply economic analysis as to what led the first European settlers, the first pioneers, if you will, to establish colonies in America. So again, Europeans will be coming in the 1500s and early 1600s from various places of Europe to establish those colonies on behalf of their monarchs, of course. But the motivation behind, for the most part, not always, but there's again a great motivation, is again to establish an outpost on the other side of the Atlantic in the Americas that will serve the mother country in Europe economically. Okay, so there was an economic purpose, an economic function for establishing those colonies. And so this is how we're going to proceed, again, by looking at early colonization in part 3. And of course, in part 2, one of the things that we examine in great length, of course, is, mercantilism. This is the international economic system that began to flourish around the 1300s, but it's not until the 1400s when we see mercantilism already very well established. And again, this is the economic system that served as a bridge between the feudal system of the past and, in the future, the rise of capitalism. Okay, so there was a transition between, again, feudalism and capitalism. Again, capitalism came after feudalism. In that intermediate stage, if you will, between feudalism and capitalism was mercantilism. Again, this is the economic system that transformed the European society, the European economic system, of course, and brought about a middle class. So we talked about that in great depth in session 2. The rise of the merchant class, which was like the forerunner of a middle class, for example. The association of merchants and creating guilds, the merchant guild, for example. Joint stock companies, and merchants going into finance as well, in many cases, like in Italy, and earning certain rights from their monarchs, again, charters of rights, and so on and so forth. So there's great change, great economic transformations taking place with the rise of mercantilism. Again, this international economic system based on trade, and that introduced gold as the monetary system, again, of commercial exchange. So again, mercantilism played a key role in the colonization of America, because when America was discovered by Columbus, and of course, as the Spaniards are arriving afterwards to explore the mainland of America, there was great expectations in Europe for the new discovery, concerning the new discovery in terms of a new commercial opportunity presented to the Europeans, that this newfound land was going to present the Europeans with the land that they lacked in order to cultivate crops or generate certain products for what now it appears to be again a world market. Again, what mercantilism is actually introducing to the world is the idea that the world has become a marketplace, that there is a world market, in other words, that that certain products have a certain appeal, a certain demand around the world, and now there's the opportunity to produce them and to ship them to all over the world to where the consumers are. In other words, so something that might be very valuable, very precious, like silks, that is produced in China, can be sold in Europe, can be sold in, now of course we're going to see, of course, America as well participating in that, as America will be colonized by Europeans. Spices produced in India will be consumed in the Middle East, will be consumed in Europe, and will be eventually consumed everywhere. Again, this is what we mean about the marketplace. So again, the Europeans are seeing the Americas as the land of opportunity in terms of a commercial opportunity. Particularly what we're talking about is a commercial opportunity that, well, if there is a world market, there's a demand for certain commodities, certain products, well, this is the land where we can actually generate them, in other words. So the colonies will serve that purpose. Okay, the colonies are going to engage in the production of certain goods, certain products for the European monarchies, the ones that are engaging in the process of colonization, and the colony is going to serve the purpose of producing those products that the European powers are going to commercialize around the world. So the colonies, for the most part, will have economies oriented towards exports. Okay, they're going to be, again, export-led economies in which the colonists are going to work in certain economic enterprises. They're going to generate products that will be shipped back to Europe, to their mother country, and from that point the mother country is going to distribute those goods around the world. Okay, so again, even Europe is going to be changing, because this provided the European kingdoms an opportunity to transform their simple kingdoms now into a commercial empire, in other words. So Spain, for example, Portugal, which were really small kingdoms, not necessarily territorially, although of course Portugal is very, very small territorially, but nonetheless, those were just simple kingdoms, if you will, that existed in Europe, that were on a par equal to the other kingdoms of Europe. Now, because they're now massively engaged in this process of colonization in the New World, they're going to rise in status, again, as they're establishing a series of colonies in the Americas, and those colonies are going to be used for extracting certain resources or generating certain products that Portugal and Spain are going to be commercializing around the world. So they're going to become commercial empires, okay? No longer just traditional simple kingdoms, but rather commercial empires, that is to say. And the same will be true about France, Holland, and England after the Spanish and the Portuguese. But Portuguese and the Spanish are going to pioneer this process of change in Europe. So once again, mercantilism is the engine, again, of colonization, the European colonization of America. Okay, so what Europeans are looking at in the Americas, again, is the opportunity to establish, to develop export-led enterprises to generate products for the world market. So, as we'll see, ever since the beginning, after Columbus discovered America in 1492, when the Europeans are coming after him, they're going to be looking particularly for specific resources that were extremely valuable in this new commercial market economy that we call simply mercantilism. Again, this is international trade. In other words, they're coming in great numbers because they're looking for land to establish, for example, things like plantations to grow products. Again, they can actually export. They're looking for gold because gold has now attained the status of money, not only in just one place, particularly like Europe, but virtually all of the places that are conducting international trade, that are engaged in international trade, they're all accepting gold as the method of payment. I mean, this is money now. So, of course, many of the people that are beginning to arrive from Europe, like particularly like the Spaniards, for example, the Spaniards were looking for gold. They're looking for gold mines, gold deposits, or cities of gold, for that matter, because this is something new. This is something new that is arising within Europe, but also in places like Asia, the Middle East, etc. Again, gold is money. Gold is the source is the basis of wealth. So they're looking for gold, and they're looking also for other resources that they can actually turn into products as well, of value as well. So they're also looking for resources, whether those resources might be silver, for example, or timber, or other products, again, from the landscape itself, from nature, that they can actually gather and extract and export to other places of the world. Okay, so it's very important. Again, this is an economic interpretation, again, of colonization. Of course, there's other forces involved in colonization, something we're going to see very, very, very exclusively in the third topic of the semester, and that is religion. Again, so religion is also going to be another force that is pushing Europeans out of Europe to come to the New World to establish colonies. So it's not just economics, of course. Now, this particular topic just deals with that. But as we'll see in the third topic, again, religion will be yet another force. So at any rate, so we start with Spain. Again, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about Spain and Portugal, but just understanding that before we study very closely, as we'll see in just a few minutes, North America, the colonization of North America, because we have to look at the 13 colonies, etc. So it is important to note that the pioneers of colonization were, as I mentioned a moment ago, Spain and Portugal. They're the first ones to come after Columbus in the 1500s, and they're the first ones to claim huge tracts of territories across this new continent that they just discovered. Okay, Spain is going to come first because they're the ones that actually sponsored Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492. In other words, Christopher Columbus came to America in 1492 on behalf of Spain, even though his intention was to reach the Asian markets. But again, he was sent by the Spanish monarchs. So therefore, the Spaniards are going to claim the lands that they're going to be exploring. There's going to be a massive exploration of this continent throughout the 1500s and early 1600s by the Spanish, because nobody knew. When I mean nobody, I mean Europeans in this case, just how vast this new land really was. So they knew there was land, but they just didn't have a proper perspective of how gigantic, again, the continent was. So again, they're going to be engaged in massive exploration, and in this process, they're going to be claiming, again, Florida. The Spanish are going to claim, first and foremost, the Caribbean islands. Those are the first islands that the Spanish actually arrived to, and that they settled, and they established some colonial governments. Again, places like Cuba, for example, Dominican Republic. And virtually all of those colonies, all in the Caribbean basin, were Spanish all the way to the early 1600s. By the 1630s and 40s, Spain is beginning to lose some of those colonies to the French and the British. But all of those were actually claimed by Spain. So again, they're going to be also exploring North America, the Gulf of Mexico region, like, Florida, the peninsula. All of this land you see here in brown, what today called the American Southwest, Mexico, Central America, and parts of South America. Okay, so there's, again, a gigantic landmass that they're going to actually claim, settle, and colonize. And Portugal comes just after the Spaniards, and they're going to also claim portions of South America, a place that today we refer as Brazil. The country of Brazil today was actually colonized by the Portuguese just immediately after the arrival of the Spaniards to America. Again, in the eastern seaboard of South America, we're going to see Brazil. Okay, so once again, when the Spanish and the Portuguese arrive, their intent was to establish not just colonies in the sense that they just want to bring people over so they can create certain communities and kind of recreate, their own societies here in the New World. Of course, that is a process that occurs. There's a lot of people interested in pretty much relocating, finding land elsewhere, etc. It is true. But the settlers, the colonizers, if you will, the people that are coming on behalf of their monarchs, of the Spanish monarchs or the Portuguese monarchs, with land grants and so on given to them by their own respective monarchs, they're coming to establish enterprises, in other words. Okay, what we call mercantile enterprises. Remember, mercantilism is an economy based on international trade. So what a mercantile enterprise is any enterprise that will generate a product or extract a resource that is valuable in the world market. So it's for exports. All mercantile enterprises are export based. In other words, it's for exports. So first and foremost, when the Spanish arrived, one of the first enterprises they established were mining enterprises. Almost, again, ever since the 1500s, they're going to find significant quantities of gold and silver in central Mexico and also in parts of South America as well. Okay, so we're going to see silver and gold mines in the Valley of Mexico. We're going to see the founding or establishment of those enterprises for the purpose of mining the silver or extracting gold as well, and shipping the gold and the silver to Spain, of course. So there's going to be massive, of course, exports of gold and silver. Now, there, of course, as we'll see in this session, just in a few minutes, once we get to England, for example, is that there's, again, a traffic of ships, Spanish ships carrying gold and carrying silver from the port of Veracruz that were actually making stops in the Caribbean islands. And in there, we're going to see a lot of piracy. You've probably already heard the term pirates of the Caribbean. And that is because there was just, again, huge quantities of gold and silver that were being shipped out by the Spanish from Mexico. And as they were transferring those precious metals to Spain, they had to make stops again in their other colonies in the Caribbean to actually pick up some other goods. And there we're going to see a lot of piracy raidings, if you will, of pirates that were actually trying to steal some of the gold that was being shipped. But again, needless to say, mining is a very important mercantile enterprise that is established very early on when the Spaniards arrived. The second mercantile enterprise is the plantation. Again, this is a commercial enterprise. It's an agricultural enterprise. It's based on exports. Again, what people are growing there are things like sugar, tobacco, and the Caribbean. Again, there's a lot of sugar and tobacco plantations. There's also some in the Gulf of Mexico, present-day Mexico as well, plantations that the Spanish actually generate, and also some others in Central and South America for the purpose of growing sugar and tobacco for exports. It was a commodity, it's a precious good that had a market in places like Europe and also Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere again. So there's another mercantile enterprise. And the third enterprise that the Spaniards established is the hacienda, the Spanish hacienda or hacienda. By the 1600s, again, by the 1600s, we're going to see the coming about of the Spanish hacienda, which was a commercial enterprise that was generating the products that the colonists actually required, not necessarily for export based purposes, but rather for internal markets, internal consumption of the colonies. Again, the colonies actually needed foodstuffs of various kinds in order to survive, in order to live. And so, therefore, we're going to see the creation of the Spanish hacienda. And the hacienda, again, was a place that will generate everything, not just foodstuffs, but the clothing, for example, and other commodities. So, this was a place in which many things were crafted, many things were grown, many things were produced, a hacienda. So, it was a combination of a farm to grow foodstuffs, vegetables, grains. It was also a combination of a ranch. It was not just a farm, but it was also a ranch where people would graze cattle because for meat consumption purposes, sheep, goats, and so on and so forth, like an animal farm and a ranch. It is also at the same time a factory. The hacienda was also a factory, so it was like three things in one. That was a hacienda. Where there were, again, weavers, seamstresses, artisans, crafting artwork, weaving textiles from clothing, hats, and crafting things like boots, pants, all sorts of clothing and attire, so on, for the colonists. Again, so at the same time, this is a place where, again, you got some finished products, dyes, leather, chocolate, and so on and so forth for the little convenience stores, again, within every city, within every town, and everything you will buy in those little convenience stores, if you will, everything for your daily use, for your daily food intake, and so on, was generated in the hacienda. So there were literally across the Spanish Empire in the Americas, there were thousands of haciendas scattered across the territory, because those were the places where all of the food, the clothing, and the commodities were actually made or generated, that is to say. So they're going to become central to the functioning of the Spanish colonies, that is to say, central. All right, so that was just in brief. Again, I said I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about Spanish colonization, just, for you to become just acquainted with the kind of enterprises that were established, like mining, gold, silver, plantations that were very important. Those were the main enterprises that kept the colonies going, of course, and the hacienda kept the colonies functioning because it provided everything the colonies needed. So the Portuguese adopted a almost identical model again. So whether we're talking about the Spanish enterprises or Portuguese, they're very identical. Okay, both had plantations, mining, and of course a sort of hacienda, if you will. Now we shift our attention now to North America. Okay, North America. This is where we get now going to be looking at the coming of the English settlers to North America to begin establishing their colonies, of course. And likewise, we're going to look at this process of colonization, not just exclusively by looking at England, but also by looking at the other European powers that came along with the English to North America, and will eventually, as we'll see later on in the semester, there will be, of course, competition and rivalry between them, and eventually there's going to be conflict, of course. And this is very important for understanding the future of the course, by the way. So it's important to talk about the French. It's important to talk about the Dutch and the British as they're coming to North America and establish their own colonies, because this is going to serve as a basis, the foundation for understanding, of course, conflicts that will emerge later on, that will transform the history of the English colonies, leading all the way towards the process of the Independence Revolution and beyond. All right, so let's talk about the French, the Dutch, and the British. And in this case, we have to start with understanding that the French, the Dutch, and the British came to North America primarily because North America was not yet claimed by any European power. If you looked at the map that I showed you just a moment ago, in the Spanish, for example, possessions, we're looking at, the Gulf of Mexico area or region, parts of the Southwest, Texas, California, all the way to the south. Okay? Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean islands, and so on. Warmer areas for the most part. Warmer or hot and humid, which were very, very similar climates to the ones that Spain and Portugal had back in Europe. So one of the reasons why the Spaniards and the Portuguese colonized this region, one, not the only one, but one of the reasons is because the climate was very similar back at home. When they tried to move up north, and they did in many cases, they sent explorers to North America. It was just way too cold. Okay, and they just found the climate to be not very suitable for what they, wanted. For example, establish colonies, to feel comfortable, intensive agriculture, plantations, and so on. They were looking for gold. They didn't find any. So this was a large territory that was unclaimed by anybody. And the French and the Dutch and the British, on the other hand, found in North America, as they began arriving, seeking for, to find also valuable resources. They were trying to establish a trading outpost to trade, for example, in North America and so on. They found in North America a climate that was very similar to the climate that the north part of Europe actually had. So there was something compatible, in other words, that when you look at French, Dutch, or British geography, the climate is similar. We're not talking about identical to the climate of North America. So there was certain, again, familiar kind of sensation there, in that they felt that this was a familiar thing. It was cold, cool climates, long winters, and so on. So, at any rate, so they're also, again, motivated by mercantilism. They're seeking trade. They want to establish a trading outpost so they can trade with the Native American population, something of value that they can ship back to Europe and make, of course, generate wealth. They're also trying to look at a trade route. In other words, there was a belief by the European that there was perhaps a river, a canal, that they could cross in North America that will take them to the Pacific Ocean, so they could continue navigating all the way to Asia and reach China, the Asian markets. So when they're going to be arriving, in many cases, they're thinking that there might be a passage. There might be a river system we can take, so we can actually journey through North America, across North America, and reach China, in other words. But as we'll see, they didn't find that connection. They didn't find that passage. They explored, of course, and instead they're going to settle and eventually colonize North America. They're going to establish a series of colonies, in other words, for the purpose of extracting certain commodities or products to ship them to Europe, so again the mother country can actually commercialize with them, of course. So now the difference between the French, the Dutch, and the British in how they approach colonization versus, let's say, the Spanish and the Portuguese to the south is that, for the most part, what the French, the Dutch, and the British are doing is colonizing North America in a way that the colonies themselves, each one of those colonies, are going to be established as companies. Okay? So when they're arriving, ever since the 1540s, the French, for example, arrived to Canada, as we'll see, in the 1540s, or the Dutch arrived in the early 1600s, and the British afterwards as well. Every time they establish a colony, that colony itself was a company. It was a company of merchants that had permission, a legal permit, to exist as a company in North America for the purpose of generating some product or products, commodities, on behalf of their kings in Europe, and they had the duty, the responsibility to actually ship all of those products back to Europe. So for the most part, many of those colonies were actually joint stock companies. Okay, this is very important because the Spanish and the Portuguese, all of the colonies were the private possession of the king. Okay, the king was the ultimate and supreme, actually, authority, owner of the colonies that they established in the New World, and they made all the appointments, all the political appointments, and even the religious appointments, and so on and so forth. And they, issued land grants to individuals to come into the New World and establish those enterprises I mentioned. But here, what we see is that whether we're talking about Holland, the Dutch, or the French, or the British, what we have is an association of merchants who create a company back in Europe, and they obtain a legal charter, okay, a legal permit from their kings to come to the New World as a company and establish actually a colony that in itself is actually a company, if you will. Okay, it's actually a company. The legal status, again, are one of companies, trading companies. So this is one of the main differences again that we're going to see in the colonization of North America. So now that we understand that, now let's look at the French, the Dutch, and the British, of course, colonization. So let's look at the French. We have to start with the French because the French were the first ones to colonize North America. So we're going through some form of chronological order, okay, based on chronological order. Okay, so the French, I mentioned, they are beginning to arrive in the 1540s. They sent expeditions to North America, first to explore the region, what today we call Eastern Canada, okay, present day Eastern Canada, that region. Navigators are trying to actually find a passage across North America to go to China. And in this process, the French established outposts, and after they're arriving, the explorers, some of them are merchants, and they're beginning to establish outposts, they encounter the Native American population of this region. And the Native American population, the so-called Hurons, okay, let me just scroll all the way to here. The Hurons, as they're called, the Hurons are going to provide very valuable assistance to the French in terms of helping the French survive in this region, helping them, in terms of hunting animals, helping them with food, some corn, for example, beans and squash that they're offered to the French, how to build a hut, and fishing, you name it. So the Hurons are going to be extremely valuable, helping the French actually accommodate to the climate, to the terrain, to the region, helping them how to survive, and so on and so forth. This is the Native American population. And there's going to be some intermarrying, of course, between the French and the Hurons, of course, and a lot of cultural exchange. There's going to be like a hybrid culture, so to speak, arising here. So the French, of course, are trying to find some form of commodity or product that they can actually trade. In other words, look, we're here to do trade, so we need to find what valuable product or resource we can actually ship to France, so we can actually, make some form of fortune or wealth and so on. So it is here that they discover the furs. Okay, the furs of the Hurons, again, used to wear certain clothing made from the fur of a local animal, an animal that only exists in North America, the beaver. And as some of this clothing is finding its way back to Paris, back to France, back in Paris and back in France, the people of France are going to become extremely, extremely fascinated about this fur, and there's going to be now a growing demand for it, in other words. So the French just found what they were looking for. They found that what this region has to offer is furs. This animal is plentiful. It exists in vast quantities, vast numbers. The Hurons know how to hunt this animal, the hiding places, the breeding grounds, and so on. They know how to set the traps, what are the seasons and that they migrate, and so on. So this actually, again, provided the opportunity for the French to start the so-called fur trade. By the 1600s, again, by the beginning of that century, the 1600s, we're going to see now the fur trade now in full gear. Okay, now the French are exporting massive quantities of furs, exporting this fur to Paris, and from Paris we're going to see, of course, the commercialization of this product. They made clothing, they made attires, coats, hats, and so on, made from that, and it was sold at very high prices back in Europe. Okay, again, the fur trade, they become a precious commodity in the world market because it was not just sold within France, it will be sold all across Europe. Again, all across Europe. There was now a growing demand for this product, and people were willing to pay money for that. So we got now French merchants in Canada, what today we call Canada, are now expanding their base of operations to not just live in small nested communities or settlements, but rather to really now integrate the Hurons into this larger and larger economic system we call mercantilism. The Hurons are subcontracted by the French to go out there, do the hunting and the preparation of the fur, and they go to the meeting points where there were French merchants, expecting the arrival of the Hurons with those furs, and France will exchange certain products that the Hurons demanded. Now, the Hurons are not very interested in gold because they're not yet, again, in this monetary system, that is to say. They don't use it. So it's not like they're going to be paid gold and they can turn around and use gold for commercial exchange within their own communities. So what the Hurons are doing instead is demanding that they get paid with certain products that they consider valuable, that were unknown to them, but they consider extremely valuable. The French introduced things like iron tools, like skillets, for example, or plows, for farming. And they demand that. They demand, of course, in many cases, the guns that the French use. And also the horse. The French also introduced the horse to North America, and the horse will also become a very precious commodity, if you will, for the Native Americans, that in many cases they traded a lot of furs for a horse as well. Okay, so at any rate, this begins again the process of colonization. The French are now expanding their networks across what today is called Eastern Canada, and by 1608 they establish a joint stock company that is called the Royal Company of New France. Okay, in 1608. So again, it is a company, okay, called the Royal Company of New France, and it begins in Eastern Canada, by the way, this region right here, where the Hurons were located. But from 1608, as we move onwards across that century and beyond, the French are extending their territorial control, if you will, across the Great Lakes region, all of the Great Plains of North America, going all the way south to the Gulf of Mexico in what today is the Louisiana state, or the port of New Orleans. Again, they're going to actually create the port of New Orleans. So all this territory that you see here in blue constituted the Royal Company of New France all the way to the time of the French and Indian War, by the way, in the 1650s and 60s, where France is actually going to lose all of that, by the way, to the British, something we're going to see, of course, much, much later. But what is interesting to note here is that the French are not just expanding their territorial control through massive settlements and colonization. It's not like they're bringing tens of thousands of French people in order to actually establish a series of towns and settlements all across this region. They are indeed, populating very heavily Eastern Canada and New Orleans here in the Gulf of Mexico. So the question remains, how is it then that the French are able to claim all of this land for the French king, for the French monarch, as being a colony of France? And the process is one that require, of course, building Indian alliances, in other words. So the French are not really colonizing this region with French people, but rather that the Native American population that lived in this region are loyal to the King of France, to the French, because they're involved in commercial exchange, in the fur trade, in other words. So the French, what they do is that they go and they talk to the chief of a tribe or an Indian nation, and they make a pact, they make an alliance with that chief, and bring that entire tribe or Indian nation into the French sphere of influence. That is to say, they're incorporated into the French colonial system, in other words. In the policy that the French use to accomplish this is one that is called gift-giving policy. In other words, they understood very quickly that in order to build an alliance with Native Americans, one of the best ways to do it is by using how Native Americans build alliances. How Native American chiefs build alliances with other chiefs, they exchange gifts. So whenever you come forth and you give a gift, not just once, but let's say every now and then, every time you meet, maybe once a year, maybe twice a year, etc. Every time there's a meeting of chiefs, there's chiefs. That is how Indians, chiefs, create diplomacy, things like alliances. And so the French learned that very quickly, and they're engaged in this massive building of alliances through called gift giving. So this is the primary reason why, again, so many millions and millions of Native American groups are going to become partners and allies of the French, and in many cases later on, as we'll see, they're going to actually aid the French in their conflicts with, let's say, the British, the French and the Indian Alliance, for example, the French and Indian War that we're going to see is the French and the Indians together fighting the British, of course, again. So this is, very important for understanding future developments, of course. The forming of the Royal Company of New France, again, through the process of gift giving. All right. All right, so now Holland, very quickly. So the Dutch are going to follow the French after the fur trade begins. We're going to see that the Dutch are also interested in establishing a foothold, if you will, in North America. They're also interested in the fur trade. So in 1602, the Dutch create a company that is going to be instrumental in also the operations taking place here in North America, and that is the Dutch East India Company. Now, the Dutch East India Company was created by a society of merchants, Dutch merchants, for the purpose of bringing spices from India. So again, there's a whole different, strategy here. It's just from the spice trade. What they want is to actually bring spices from India, going around Africa, and participating in the spice trade. But there will be a sister company that the Dutch created, the Dutch West Indies. So they also call it the Dutch West India Company, that is interested in establishing a foothold, some form of outpost in North America for the purpose of participating in the fur trade. So this is going to be a quite different type of operation. And the Dutch West India Company in 1609 creates the very first joint stock company in North America that was established for the fur trade, and they name it as the New Netherland Company. The New Netherland Company in 1609. It was actually dubbed as the New Amsterdam Colony because many of the merchants who created the New Netherland Company in 1609 were merchants from Amsterdam. Okay, so many of them were actually from Amsterdam. That when they arrived to create the colony, it was simply referred as the New Amsterdam Colony, but it was actually a company. Once again, this is a company. Okay, in the modern sense of the word, it was called the New Netherland Company in 1609 for the purpose of, again, establishing a fur trading outpost. And this is a Dutch colony that was established in what today we call New York, the state of New York. That is to say, okay, the state of New York. And they follow a very similar pattern after the French in terms of arriving, befriending the Native American populations that were there. The Native American populations are going to provide valuable assistance to the Dutch, and there's going to be commercial exchange taking place in that the Native Americans provided the furs of the beaver to the Dutch, and in return the Dutch presented or exchanged that for merchandise, of course, cargoes that they brought, the various goods, and the Native American population was quite happy with that kind of arrangement. Of course, they ended up, of course, extending their network of commercial exchange and operations all across this region to what today, again, is called New York. So before New York became part of the British Empire, again, in 1664, it was actually, again, a Dutch colony that was conducting operations in the fur trade, by the way, okay, in the fur trade. So you can see that the primary reason why the Europeans are arriving to North America is commercial, whether we're talking about the French in Canada, we talked about the fur trade, or the Dutch arriving to this region of North America to establish the New Netherland Company. And again, it was also a company of merchants that were exporting furs back to Holland. And we're going to get, of course, much later in the semester to where the Dutch are going to lose the colony to the British, of course. And it will be renamed as New York, by the way. So at any rate, now let's look at the British. And very quickly, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about colonization, looking at all the colonies, because we're just looking at the major factors that pushed the Europeans out of Europe to come to North America and begin the process of establishing settlements and colonies again. So it's an economic interpretation of colonization. So the British come at last. Okay, so the French came first, only followed by the Dutch, and it is only after the Dutch that the British, that did not want to fall behind, they also are interested in establishing some form of presence, claiming some territories and so on, for the purpose of conducting trade or building an enterprise for exports of some kind, etc. Because this was the way to go. This is the way to transform the kingdom from a simple kingdom sustained by tribute to one that is growing economically because of its participation in trade. So the British now arrive initially in 1588, not necessarily to establish a large colony, even though they have those aspirations, but in 1588 they're beginning to engage in this process of colonization primarily because they want to build a fort. Okay, they want to build a fort for the purpose of stationing pirates there, okay, in North America. So we talked about how the Spanish were conducting mining operations in central Mexico, extracting silver and gold and shipping the gold to Spain. And we talked about piracy, for example, in the Caribbean islands, there are going to be pirates, of course. And of course, that's true. And those were British pirates, by the way. And there was a conflict between Spain and England, or they will be called, of course, later on Great Britain. In Europe, there was a conflict. It was religious in origin, in many cases, Catholics and Protestants and so on. And one way that the British or the English were really fighting the Spanish was by stealing their gold. It's gold that was being extracted out of the Americas and shipped to Spain. And this gold was being stolen, if you will, in the Caribbean islands, if you will, by pirates, by British pirates. So they needed a kind of base of operations from which to launch their ratings, if you will, into those Caribbean islands. And so they were looking in a place in North America to build a fort, of course. And they commissioned Sir Raleigh, a British pirate, of course, to build a community, a fort, in this case, a military fort in 1588, in North America, as close as possible to the Spanish colony of Florida. That will serve as a launching pad, if you will, for the British pirates to launch their operations, if you will. Okay, so Raleigh is now commissioned to build a colony, and he's going to attempt to build a colony in an island called Roanoke, in what today is the state of North Carolina. Again, this is North Carolina. There's a little island called Roanoke. There's like 100 people that come over in 1588, and many of them are pirates, by the way. And so, as the colony is beginning to be built, they ran out of supplies, and they have to send the captain back to London for more supplies, for more ships, and so on. And when the captain returns, many months later, it is estimated that he returns about a year later. There were no survivors. Nobody was there. So nobody knows what happens to them. But what we know from the actual captain, of course, is that the pirates that were brought, initially, those 100 settlers, were very hostile to the Native American population. So the Native American population just fled. They went into the mainland and left those people to survive on their own, in other words. So, because they were pirates. So pirates just, are not like merchants. Merchants, of course, and other explorers might have manners. They're a little bit more civilized, if you will, but the pirates were not. So as the pirates arrived to Roanoke, they did not try to befriend the natives. In other words, to have the natives actually help them build a colony, and the natives just left, in other words. And of course, when the captain returned, there were no survivors. So this was a failed experiment at colonization in 1588. But what we learned then, again, from that experiment, is that one of the things that the captain reported from witnessing and socializing with the natives initially was that there was, again, the use of tobacco by the natives. In other words, this is a place where tobacco was grown, so that gave the British an idea that, well, maybe this is something we can do. if we actually colonize this region, maybe we can grow tobacco, because tobacco was already growing in great demand back in Europe. We mentioned in the beginning of this session when we were talking about the Spanish and the Portuguese establishing, for example, the plantation, sugar plantation, tobacco plantations, shipping sugar and tobacco to Europe, which was an indigenous plant of America. This is a Native American plant that has been used for thousands of years for religious purposes. This plant was gaining a lot of popularity back in Europe and also in Africa, and people were, becoming very fond of this plant. They were using it for many purposes. They were smoking tobacco for headaches and so on and so forth. So there was a growing market. So this gave the British an idea that if they are going to come to this part of the world, they're not going to build a fort anymore. They're not interested in building a piracy fort, but rather they want to establish now colonies that will generate certain products that are extremely valuable in Europe and elsewhere. So again, in 1600, the British are already creating their own companies, like the British East India Company, to go to the Far East for the spices, for example. And so they're in the process of participating now in international trade. They're giving rise to different companies, for example, like the British East India Company. And also they create, in the following years, after 1600, the London and the Plymouth companies to establish a foothold in North America. So they create two different companies, by the London merchants and also merchants in Plymouth. Plymouth is actually a city in England as well. So there's two. And they both receive legal charters from the English monarch to come to North America to establish a commercial enterprise, again, and a trading outpost, that is to say. The London Company established a charter, actually received a charter to create a company in North America that will be called the Virginia Stock Company in 1609. Okay, so the London merchants that created the London Company created this little company in North America called the Virginia Stock Company that will be used to grow tobacco. Okay, this is going to be a tobacco company, that is to say, a tobacco plantation trading company. We're going to build plantations, we're going to grow tobacco and export the tobacco to England, and from England we're going to actually sell it across Europe and elsewhere, by the way. So again, this is going to lead to the creation of Jamestown in 1609 and the establishment of Virginia Colony. But remember, it was not just Virginia Colony, it was the Virginia Stock Company. It was owned by a group of merchants from London that wanted to actually come to North America to grow tobacco for export, that is to say, the tobacco plantation, that is to say, this commercial enterprise for exports. So again, tobacco was becoming a precious commodity in the world market. It was finding a market not only within Europe. This is going to be finding a market virtually all around the world. Okay, a precious commodity, by the way. It will be one of those commodities that will be traded globally, that is to say. And there's going to be a lot of tobacco grown in Virginia Stock Company or Virginia Colony that ended up being consumed all over the world. Now, the Plymouth Company is now interested in establishing also a company to the north of Virginia to participate in the fur trade. Okay, so they're looking at the success of the French. They're looking at also the Dutch, how the Dutch are also arriving again to North America, and they don't want to fall behind. So they're also trying to establish also a fur trading company, if you will, in North America, and they're beginning to bring merchants to establish outposts in what today is New England. and they will eventually create two different colonies. Again, that were fur trading companies or fur trading colonies. One will be called Plymouth, and the other one will be called Massachusetts. One established in 1620, and the other one in the 1630s again. So again, we're going to see that the Plymouth Company is also trying to participate in the fur trade, sending merchants to this part of the world to establish the first colonies again. That will be part of New England, what will be Plymouth Colony, and the other one, the Massachusetts Bay Company, by the way. It's called Massachusetts Bay Company, for the purpose of participating in the fur trade as well. Okay, so those were the intentions initially. Of course, those companies, particularly the Plymouth Company, is going to have enormous difficulties establishing permanent settlements in this part of the world, and they're going to actually resort to volunteers, and many of the religious communities, like the Puritans, of course, are going to volunteer to become the first settlers of the Plymouth Company in this part of the world, whether it's going to establish Plymouth Colony or Massachusetts Massachusetts Colony, and there will be settled, they will be populated by religious groups who are coming on behalf of companies, again, like in this case the Plymouth Company, to live in the lands of the company for the purpose of creating a colony and populating, claiming the land on behalf of the company. That is to say, something we're going to see very closely, of course, in the third topic. Not in this one, of course. The religious colonization of North America by religious groups, that is to say. So in conclusion, what we learn in this topic, in the 3 sessions we have covered, is that trade served as the historical force behind the European discovery, conquest, and colonization of America. Trade, again, that was the engine of history that pushed the Europeans out of Europe to engage in the process of discovery. Eventually, in this exploration, we're going to see the discovery of America that brought, of course, the conquistadors to the New World, because they were looking for valuable resources like gold and land, etc. And of course, there's going to be certain confrontations with the Aztecs and the Incas and others, of course. But trade was part of this process again that pushed Europeans out of Europe and ended up in the New World. And the conquest was part of this process. And the colonization itself, we just covered this in this topic, that the colonization of America was part also of this process of Europeans trying to establish, of course, enterprises or outposts for the purpose of generating items of trade, products, resources that were valuable, that could be shipped and exported all over the world. We learned that the rise of global trade networks back in the 12 and 1300s, this is very important, very key. Those trading networks led to a technological revolution in navigation. Okay, so when there was now long distance trade and there was commercial exchange between the Europeans and the peoples of the Middle East, in India and in China, we're going to see that again, people wanted to accelerate the pace of trade. And in this process, because of the ideas that were exchanged in this process of trading goods with back and forth, that led to the new technologies. The Portuguese particularly were able to create in the 13 and 1400s technology in navigation technologies that brought the age of exploration and discovery. We talked about again how this gave rise to mercantilism by the 1400s, an international economy that upheld gold and precious goods as wealth, which in turn brought the conquistadors to the New World, because as this new world was discovered, and now there's now an international economy that says that gold is valuable, and one way to actually search for it or acquire it is by either finding it, like a huge gold deposit, or by engaging in trade. Again, that actually made possible that there will be many people coming in the 1500s, known as the conquistadors, looking for gold, looking for land, that will be engaged in the process of course, the conquest. Another thing to learn from this is the rise of pandemics in world history. Again, that because of this commercial exchange that was taking place, this trade, people are not just trading goods and ideas, people are also trading microbes and germs that are now spreading worldwide because of long distance trade. And of course, as germs are spreading all over the globe, the spreading of yellow fever, for example, and smallpox at the time of the contact between the Europeans, the Spanish, and the Native Americans, made possible the conquest of the Aztecs and the Inca empires, because again, there were outbreaks of epidemic disease in the New World that weakened the leadership of those empires and enabled, in this case, the conquistadors to actually conquer those two large empires. And at the end, what we see is that the rise of global markets that influenced the colonization of America by merchants who established enterprises for exporting sugar, tobacco, furs, gold, and silver. So this is another thing that we learn, that the rise of a world market, again, that there's a demand for certain commodities, again, this idea that the world is a marketplace, that there's a demand for certain precious goods, that influenced the colonization of America itself, again, by merchants who were coming on behalf of the European monarchs to establish enterprises like plantations, for example, mines, and so on, trading companies like the fur companies and so on, for the purpose of generating particularly those products like sugar, tobacco, furs, gold, and silver. So the colonization of America itself was part of this process, again, that was connecting the world together commercially, called mercantilism, creating a world market, and the colonization of America was part of that. The commercial opportunity that had been presented to the Europeans with the discovery of America, that is now going to be used for generating so much products that will be shipped around the world. Okay, so at the end, again, this is the end of session 3. The questions are presented at the very end of the lecture outlines. Those are already posted on Blackboard. And this is the end of our discussion. If you have any questions, please let me know. This is the end. We have reached